Recently, we released a video looking at an oft-overlooked communist state in Asia that found itself on the front lines of the Cold War, with two of the great powers competing for influence. While the rolling steppes of Mongolia are not usually the first to come to mind for many when discussing 20th century geopolitics, there is surprising depth and subtlety in the politics of a nation that many considered to be simply a vassal state of Moscow. I'm your host David, and this week we are returning to Mongolia to finish our story. This is the Cold War. So, in that last video on the Mongolian People's Republic, we started at the very beginning of the state's history, looking at its formation and how the Soviets helped to keep it afloat. We then looked at how the Second World War and Mongolia's role in the Sino-Soviet split brought the MPR even closer to the Soviets and thrust Mongolia onto the front lines of Cold War geopolitics. But we ended up by suggesting that despite unignorable similarities in the MPR's and the USSR's development, by the late 1950s, Mongolian domestic politics had started to diverge from trends to the north. What happened when the MPR's Yumjagin Tsedenbal decided to build a cult of personality instead of liberalizing the system as Khrushchev had tried? How did its economy develop, and how did the system eventually collapse? To pick up where we left off, by the early 1960s, Tsedenbal had forced his opponents into exile and essentially established himself as the unchallenged leader of the MPR. Thus, when Leonid Brezhnev visited Ulaanbaatar in January 1966 to provide Soviet military support, there was nobody left to challenge Tsedenbal, and he was free to develop his cult of personality. The rise of Brezhnev as leader of the USSR in 1964, just 2 years prior to his visit to Ulaanbaatar, was a particularly fortuitous development here. And why, you might ask? Well, as you'll see in our video looking at the Uzbek cotton scandal, Brezhnev brought with him the stability of cadres doctrine. This was characterized by Brezhnev's desire to have men in charge that he could trust, meaning that he effectively devolved power to Republican leaders he liked and gave them a blank check to rule as they saw necessary. Though Mongolia was obviously not officially a Soviet republic, in practice Brezhnev's stability of cadres doctrine extended to Mongolia given how close the ties were between the two countries. Though Mongolia was obviously not officially a Soviet republic, in practice Brezhnev's stability of cadres doctrine extended to Mongolia given how close the ties were between the two countries. As such, Tsedenbal's purges and unwillingness to liberalize the system to the same extent as Khrushchev had done didn't matter. If he had Brezhnev's trust and Tsedenbal thought he was taking the best course of action, his position was safe. With this, Tsedenbal wasted little time to begin his self-aggrandizement. For example, on his 50th birthday in September 1966, he was presented with the highest distinction of Hero of the Mongolian People's Republic, as well as an Order of Sukhpatar for his special services to the party, state, and Mongolian people. A decade later, on his 60th birthday, he received another Order of Sukhpatar, and an exhibition about his life was opened in Ulaanbaatar. At the same time, Brezhnev awarded him an Order of Lenin. In total, he received, or gave himself, 6 Order of Sukhpatar awards throughout his rule. Tsedenbal also enjoyed wearing 11 rows of medals and an army marshal's star-studded baton with diamonds during his public appearances. This image was hardly received well in private by ordinary Mongolians, most of whom earned a pittance working in the factories and fields which formed the backbone of the MPR's planned economy. Tsedenbal's Russian wife, Anastasia Filotova, was too a particularly unpopular figure. Tsedenbal's 1991 obituary in the New York Times stated that she was widely seen as the power behind the throne, and Soviet influence on everyday life and the Mongolian system was rife. Tsedenbal's wife almost certainly played a role in this, as well as the Mongolian leader's ongoing sympathy for the USSR's complicated relationship with China and his willingness to allow Soviet troops to remain in Mongolia. Despite Tsedenbal's obvious affinity for the Soviet Union, however, his attempt to conduct education at all levels in Russian rather than Mongolian was narrowly defeated in the early 1970s amid opposition from other party members. In a way, this was a victory for any nationalist sentiment that remained in the MPRP after the purges of the early 1960s. Relatedly, and in the meantime, changes were taking place within the MPRP apparatus. Communist Party membership had risen so much during the 1960s that by the 16th Party Congress in July 1971, 82% of the delegates who attended were new. 2 years later, in June 1974, however, Tsedenbal expanded his power even further when he resigned his position as chairman of the Council of Ministers, which was effectively the premiership, and was elected chairman of the Presidium of the People's Great Khural, the national legislature. This formally enabled him to become Mongolia's head of state. Up until this point, Tsedenbal's positions as General Secretary of the MPRP and as Chairman of the Council of Ministers had been separate, so his becoming head of state did little to quell any claims he was not building a cult of personality. You might ask yourself if there were parallels with Tsedenbal's leadership of Mongolia within the Soviet Union. The case of Uzbekistan's Sharaf Rashidov could prove a useful comparison, but overall there was certainly not a cult of personality around either Khrushchev or Brezhnev after de-Stalinization. In fact, both leaders actively avoided it. The extent to which the MPR centered around Tsedenbal himself, therefore, represented a notable departure from Mongolia's tendency to follow the trends in Soviet domestic politics, which had hitherto defined its political system. The Mongolian economy, too, developed somewhat differently from the Soviet one. Though the MPRP introduced 5-year plans in the early 1930s, the Huvsgul uprising and its fallout saw them quickly abandon this in 1932. Annual plans were reintroduced in 1941 with a regular schedule of 5-year plans not established again until 1961, despite a one-off in 1948. From 1961, 5-year plans were developed regularly in line with those of the Soviet Union. Accordingly, throughout the Cold War, the Mongolian economy was largely based on agriculture and industry. To a large degree, though, this was actually against Brezhnev's wishes. Whereas Brezhnev wanted the MPR to provide primarily agricultural goods and minerals for the USSR, Tsedenbal sought to develop a greater balance between heavy industry and agriculture. As such, by 1985, a reported 18.3% of national income was derived from agriculture and a further 32.4% came from industry. The remainder was mostly based on domestic trade and services, which accounted for 31.6%. Moreover, in June 1962, Mongolia joined the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or COMECON, which in general terms was similar to the Americans' Marshall Plan. But the 60s was nevertheless a pretty rough decade for the Mongolian economy. Mongolia was plagued not only by bad weather like blizzards, which in 1967 alone caused the loss of $37 million worth of livestock, but its lack of raw materials for heavy and light industry also hampered sectoral development. Indeed, despite Tsedenbal's hopes for Mongolian industry, by 1986 agriculture still accounted for almost 60% of the MPR's exports, and the industrial goods they did export were not considered competitive in the Eastern Bloc. China's withdrawal of economic support for Mongolia following the Sino-Soviet split only dampened things further. In fact, things were so poor that following the end of the fourth 5-year plan for the period 1966 to 70, the MPRP admitted that the economy had, quote, not developed as rapidly as those of fraternal socialist states. However, the fifth 5-year plan, covering 1971 to 75, did facilitate some net gains for the MPR's economy. This was principally because the plan was underwritten by Moscow, and the economic investment from COMECON finally started to yield results as specialists and their families poured into Mongolia from every corner of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. Among those who moved to Mongolia was Alexander Zelensky, and that surname is no doubt familiar to almost all of you. Alexander is the father of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian president's father worked in the mining sector in Erdenet, where Volodymyr lived for 4 years during his childhood. Anyway, during the fifth 5-year plan, Mongolia's gross industrial output rose by 45% compared to the fourth plan, but the economic stagnation which characterized Brezhnev's leadership of the USSR in the 1970s quickly jettisoned any hope that this was a sign of more meaningful and prolonged growth. Among Mongolians, Tsedenbal subsequently became known as the Khan of Stagnation for his poor economic policies. So, with the USSR propping up the MPR's economy and Tsedenbal's cult of personality firmly in place, life in Mongolia remained fairly stable throughout the 1970s. But Brezhnev's death in 1982 prompted the new Soviet leadership under Yuri Andropov to consider alternative ways to manage the communist system. Increasingly aware of the mounting external and internal pressure on his position, Tsedenbal did not miss the opportunity to enact another purge of the party from 1981, which saw a third of the Central Committee dismissed from their posts. He also did not miss the opportunity to cover himself in glory once again. At the 18th Party Congress, he was praised as the best leader of party and state by fellow MPRP members. Tsedenbal's good fortune would soon change, though, amid the burgeoning atmosphere of reform in the USSR. On the 9th of August 1984, when Tsedenbal was on holiday in Moscow, the Kremlin's doctor diagnosed him as being overworked. Tsedenbal had been suffering with health problems since at least 1973, but his erratic behavior had since become a major concern. The Politburo thus summoned other senior members of the MPRP to Moscow and told them that Tsedenbal had to go. 2 weeks later, on the 23rd of August, the Mongolian Politburo dismissed Tsedenbal from all positions due to his state of health and with his agreement. By many accounts, Tsedenbal's fall was rather graceful despite how disliked he was, but any personal hopes for a positive legacy Tsedenbal may have harbored could not have lasted long. Indeed, in 1988, the MPRP officially blamed him for the major shortcomings and omissions of the last 40 years. And in March 1990, he was completely expelled from the Communist Party. Tsedenbal retired to Moscow, where he lived with his family until his death in April 1991. Moscow handpicked Tsedenbal's replacement, Jambin Batmonk, a figure who had been Prime Minister of Mongolia since 1974. By the 1980s, the stagnation of the Mongolian economy was unignorable, and Batmonk, much like Gorbachev, recognized that the over-centralization of the economy was causing issues. He began to reform the system slowly, even going so far as to print a full translation of Gorbachev's speech to the 1986 Congress of the CPSU, demanding the liberalization of the economy in the MPRP's mouthpiece, UNEN, which played a similar role to that of Pravda in the USSR. Batmonk also proposed reforming the bureaucracy. However, he was slow to replace cadres who resisted changes to the system, although the fact that he highlighted these challenges himself in a speech to the MPRP members in July 1987 suggests that his intentions were sincere. Nevertheless, perhaps predictably, changes in the USSR under Gorbachev would hasten the process of reform in Mongolia. As the USSR was facing its own economic difficulties amid perestroika, it increasingly struggled to provide Mongolia with the fiscal and human capital support it had become accustomed to. Moreover, Gorbachev started pursuing a pivot to the east after a speech in Vladivostok in 1986, in which he outlined his concerns over tensions in the region. By April 1987, he had withdrawn 25% of the Soviet forces stationed in Mongolia. In response, Mongolia signed an agreement with the PRC in June 1987, where they outlined the peaceful resolution of border disputes, as well as their intentions to increase trade again after the Sino-Soviet split. The same year, Mongolia also established formal relations with the United States. These moves represented, in effect, an indirect acknowledgement that Mongolia would have to start trying to stand on its own 2 feet without the protection of the Soviet Union. As Mongolia slowly but surely lost the USSR's material backing, criticism of the socialist system grew from within the MPRP. In 1988, key government leaders challenged communist policies and even floated the idea of establishing a fully democratic system. The next year, in 1989, a commission appointed by the Politburo investigated the earlier purges of Choibalsan and Tsedenbal, concluding that at least 20,000 of the Mongolians who the state had executed or exiled should have their names cleared of any crimes. And then, in a move that proved to be fatal for Mongolia's one-party system, the MPRP put on a celebration of International Human Rights Day shortly after in December 1989. According to historian Maurice Rosabi, the scene observers in Government House witnessed on December 10, 1989 both surprised and shocked them. As snow drifted down gently, 200 people marched around with banners and signs calling for the elimination of bureaucratic oppression, as well as a promise to implement perestroika and glasnost. It was increasingly evident that the tides were shifting, perhaps irreversibly so. Remarkably, on the 11th and 12th of December at the 7th plenum of the 19th Congress of the MPRP, officials supported the demands for perestroika and glasnost. The Mongolians were keen to avoid the gruesome scenes of Tiananmen Square 6 months earlier in neighboring China and wanted to prove that they were not cut from the same cloth. The December 10th protesters had also carried placards saying, quote, "A multi-party system is essential, honor human rights above all, and freedom of the press." So, days after, the Mongolian Democratic Union was formed and held its first meeting. By December 17th, its leaders had officially submitted their demands to the ruling MPRP, specifying what perestroika and glasnost looked like in their minds. But the process for the reformers from here was a bit more difficult. MPRP officials did not specify a timeline for the reforms they proposed, and it could perhaps be argued that they only nominally supported them. Those who protested and formed the Mongolian Democratic Union were primarily from the intelligentsia, and to put more pressure on the government, they needed to incorporate a broader cross-section of Mongolian society. Reformers thus started petitioning across the country in an attempt to appeal to dissatisfied workers. They found particular success in Erdenet, the city where Zelensky had grown up. Workers were tired of being treated like second-class citizens by the Soviets who managed the factories, and the reformers convinced them to turn on the MPRP. These workers were then incorporated into the Mongolian Democratic Union, and the protests against the government grew in size. The December 10th protests attracted around just 200 participants, but the next demonstrations on the 21st of January 1990 attracted thousands, and the crowd was far more diverse. By late April, the protests in Ulaanbaatar and other Mongolian cities were drawing in tens of thousands of participants on a regular basis. In the meantime, the MPRP announced that an open election for the Khural, Mongolia's parliament, would be held in June 1990, agreeing that other parties could run. These completely peaceful processes became known as the Mongolian Revolution. While the peaceful transition to a multi-party system was certainly a watershed moment, the MPRP was still at a massive advantage, namely because it had access to funds, which the Mongolian Democratic Union did not. The MPRP began buying off Mongolians, increasing wages for poorly paid workers, increasing student benefits, and offering financial support to agricultural cooperatives. Given that these were the constituent groups of the reform movement, this spelled trouble, and the MPRP was confident that it would win in a competitive election. Simultaneously, cracks started to emerge in the nascent reform movement. Perhaps surprised by how quickly they had managed to win over the MPRP's representatives, the reformers did not have time to articulate a proper political program which offered an alternative to communism. Instead, they simply agreed that the regime should go. But what precisely would it be replaced with? Ahead of the election, the reformers had split into various camps, among them the Mongolian Democratic Party, the National Progressive Party, and the Mongolian Social Democratic Party, all of whom had their own ideas. Despite attracting workers early on, these parties suffered from a lack of support in the countryside, particularly amidst the MPRP's efforts to buy their support. At the first Congress of the newly formed Mongolian Democratic Party, for instance, 53% were intellectuals, 40% were workers, and only 7% were agricultural workers. 45% were also university educated, which highlights how the reformist movement remained very much one built by and characterized by intellectuals. By the time of the election in June, the reform parties only offered up candidates for 346 of the 430 seats in the Khural, leaving 84 MPRP members to run unopposed. As a result of the aforementioned issues, the MPRP won a huge majority of 357 seats, while the reformers as a bloc won just 26 seats. Though the popular vote revealed more positive developments, 60% voted for the MPRP and 30% voted for the reformers, it was clear that toppling the MPRP would not be as easy as it had seemed just 6 months earlier. But looking only at the results of the election does not necessarily tell the whole story. As it became clearer throughout the 1980s that the USSR was in trouble, Mongolia started to open up to the outside world, and Western organizations and government advisors poured in. Correspondingly, the first deputy minister and economist, Davadorjin Ganbold, had been advocating for the input of advisors from the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank since the late 1980s to help the country transition from a planned economy to a free market one. As early as August 1990, representatives from the IMF visited Mongolia and produced a report outlining potential steps towards a market economy, while in May 1991, an even more comprehensive study was conducted. By late 1991, the Asian Development Bank had also issued its own report, and the now infamous economist Jeffrey Sachs, the man who many blame for the negative effects of neoliberal shock therapy reforms in Russia, had also visited Mongolia in March 1991, outlining his support for Ganbold's vision. Though there were some concerns about the negative effects of free market reforms in the short term, Ganbold decided to implement them with immediate effect. He started by privatizing the ownership of around 25 million animals before turning to enterprises. They split enterprises into large ones, enterprises worth more than $50,000, and small ones, which mostly concerned domestic trade and service operations. In an attempt to make the process as fair as possible, each Mongolian born before May 1991 was given 7 vouchers for large privatization and 3 for small privatization, in effect enabling them to buy up stakes in state-owned enterprises. However, much like Russia's voucher privatization system would be hijacked by individuals who became known as the oligarchs, Mongolia's privatization process was also beset with problems. Namely, Mongolians had grown up in a socialist planned economy, so had no conception of either the potential benefits of private ownership or the value of what they could get with their vouchers. Predictably, this left the scheme vulnerable to abuse. One study later estimated that by 2003, just 1,500 individuals owned 70% of the shares of the 330 companies that were considered large enterprises during the initial privatization process. The privatization process and the transition to a market economy was further undermined by the absence of the rule of law. There was an assumption among Western economic reformers that establishing private property rights would spontaneously generate the institutions necessary to protect it. But as the examples of Mongolia and later Russia would prove, this was simply not the case. At the same time, other elements of the reforms, namely the liberalization of prices, were wreaking havoc on the Mongolian economy. Amid price liberalization, inflation reached a rate of 325% in 1992 and remained at 183% in 1993, with horrendous impacts on ordinary Mongolians. Such inflation forced domestic industries out of business as they simply could not afford either the raw materials they needed nor their employees' salaries. Mongolian savings, too, were wiped out. To again quote the historian Morris Rosabi, consumers in the communist era had suffered shortages of goods and long lines, but prices were low. After the mid-1990s, products were available, mostly from abroad, but prices were so high and salaries so low that most consumers could only look longingly at store window displays. Nevertheless, though the Mongolian economy was in ruins, there were some positives. After the December 10th demonstrations and the peaceful transition to democracy, the following year a small Khural of 50 members was instructed to start drafting a new constitution. The entry of international economists was accompanied by a flurry of political advisors, with groups such as the Asia Foundation, an American NGO funded by the US government, and corporations opening offices in Ulaanbaatar in the early 1990s. Such groups promoted the development of civil society and also assisted the Mongolian Khural politicians in their drafting of the new constitution. By January 1992, the new constitution was adopted by the Mongolian government, coming into force on the 12th of February the same year. Consisting of 70 articles, it established a representative democracy and enshrined the freedom of political speech, press, assembly, and movement. Perhaps the most important element of the new constitution was that it reduced the size of the parliament dramatically to a single 76-member democratically elected parliament known as the State Great Khural. Elections were subsequently announced for June 1992. Despite the massive economic problems, the MPRP still managed to capitalize on the disagreements and weaknesses that had marred the reform movement in the June 1990 elections, and the MPRP won almost 60% of the popular vote and 70 of the 76 seats available in the new parliament. Still though, by the time the next parliamentary elections came around in June 1996, the MPRP finally lost its majority to the Democratic Union coalition. With this, the 7-decade rule of the MPRP finally came to an end, and the transition was complete. Overall then, to consider the Mongolian People's Republic simply as a Soviet republic in all but name would be to overlook a number of important nuances which characterized Mongolia's rather different transition to democracy and capitalism. Indeed, Tsedenbal's cult of personality was quite unique for a country so closely aligned with the USSR, and the unified reaction against it within the MPRP and Mongolian society was likely what made Mongolia's transition to democracy so peaceful. Since the early 1990s, Mongolia has remained one of the most democratic former communist countries outside the former Eastern Bloc in Europe, and has largely avoided the transitional challenges faced by most former Soviet states in Central Asia and the Caucasus. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button before it has the opportunity to award itself yet another Hero of the Mongolian People's Republic medal. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.